Bill Gates. Thank you so much for your time. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation just released its 2019 Goalkeepers Report to keep track on progress made on the SDGs. First of all, why was it important for the foundation to take that role on keeping the track on the SDGs?
Well, I hope everyone is tracking these sustainable development goals, but often in the richer countries, there's a lot of distraction. And so the opportunity once a year to take this General Assembly meeting and say, okay, during this week, let's take this report card that all the countries agreed to and see how we're doing. Are there some heroes we should talk about? Are there some things that went better than we expected? Where are we falling behind? We get several hundred people we call goalkeepers, and we try and energize them. These are people who are working on the goals in innovative ways. They want to meet each other. They want to hear from leaders, and we celebrate what's gone on while making sure, because we're very numeric, that we do a report that really reminds us that as much progress as we're making, a child in many countries, still over 10% are dying before the age of 5. And in richer countries, it's less than 1%. So the idea that any place in the world is still 10%, some almost 15%, that's outrageous, and it should galvanize us to do a better job.
This is the third edition of the Goalkeepers Report. What did you find significant this year?
Well, the big thing we did this year is we not only looked at each country and saw, okay, what's the progress on education and health during the last 20 years. We even went within the country. So we did it what we call the district level, and we saw that even there, if you didn't have a collapse or a war, health and education have improved. So progress is happening almost everywhere. But we saw that within a country, you have these huge differences. The best part of India is like a rich country. The worst part of India is like a really poor country. Within Nigeria, you have huge differences. And so hopefully that's inspiring to say, okay, what's going well in the good part of the country, and how do we accelerate a conversion? Because you can use the federal budget to help with dollars. You can use the ideas there. In some ways, it should be easier to spread best practices within a country than it is between countries. We need to do both. And Africa has, if you look at each area, it has a lot of exemplars, and it has some where things have not progressed nearly as much.
What do you think in terms of the role that government should play? When you're talking about Africa, for example, what is the responsibility of government, and are they doing enough?
Well, the government has the primary role. The only way that the education system and health system can ever work super well is if the government's collecting enough in taxes and then spending that money, picking the right workers, those workers are showing up, the quality of that work, is the line at the primary health care center is too long? Are they running out of the vaccines when the mothers come a long distance to get there? All the outsiders can do is help government. Now, in a few places like Somalia, the government's not active. So, until the government comes into place, a non-government organization can often work with the villages and create some substitute. But that is not the long-term solution. It's by working with the government, helping them build systems, increase their capacity, that the country can be self-sufficient on their own.
Now, you mentioned Nigeria earlier. You've been a strong advocate of vaccination and also fighting to ensure that children don't have polio. This year, Nigeria marked a milestone, which is reaching 3 years without polio. Can I have your reaction to that? How does this make you feel?
Well, there's a lot of credit to go around. Nigeria engaged. The heroes are the women who went house to house, even up in the northwest, northeast, at some risk to their lives in doing that. So it's a wondrous effort. We're not done. We have to get to 0 cases, and we still have some vaccine-derived cases in Africa, and we still have some wild-type cases in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But here's another milestone where it's been 3 years since any wild polio cases have been seen in Africa. We worry that it could spread back into Africa from Pakistan or Afghanistan. So we're working intensely there. But those health systems can be improved. And we learned a lot about primary health care in this effort. And that's why we're engaged, particularly with the states in the north, trying to help them get the vaccination rates up. They start below 30%, whereas some countries are, as they should be, over 90%. And so there are best practices. I work with Alika and Dangote. We're committed to help those northern states get their primary health care into a strong position.
And speaking of Mr. Dangote, last year you were in Chad to also promote vaccination and raise awareness against polio. What did you make of that experience? What did you find in terms of people on the ground? How much do they understand the need to vaccinate the children and the threat of polio, really, even when there is no case, the fact that polio remains a latent threat?
Well, the number of deaths we could avoid, there's from northern Nigeria going east, that's the area of the world where still more than 10% of the children die. And that's partly because of malaria. It's partly because the primary healthcare systems need to be a lot better. Chad has less resources. There are parts of the country that actually do quite well on vaccination. So spreading those practices, I think, is valuable.
The Sustainable Development Goal 3 aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. This is a very ambitious goal. And so how do we get there? What do you think?
Well, the world has made a lot of progress. And we're not asking any country to do something that's never been done before. Childhood deaths have been cut in half. The new vaccines getting out are part of that. Incomes going up are part of that. There's a lot of things that correlate with these improvements. Having girls get more education, treating women better so they come together and talk about are they getting the services they deserve, making sure all the mothers understand best practices about prenatal care. Women's groups have been a tactic in Asia, Bangladesh and India in particular, and now they're being tried out in parts of Africa in a culturally appropriate way. We're hoping that becomes a significant tool in Africa as well.
Okay. Now, speaking of poverty, there have been a lot of focus on an investment over the years in reducing poverty in the world, and your foundation has very much been significant in doing that. Yet many people still live in extreme poverty. So what is a failing poverty reduction in the world? What needs to be done differently, perhaps?
People who remain in extreme poverty are farmers, and a lot of them are subsistence farmers, either in Southeast Asia or Africa. So helping educate them about credit for fertilizer, better seeds, how they can store water, how they can use chickens to supplement their income, particularly if we focus on the women and the crops and things that they work on, we can uplift a lot of those farmers. Now, we have the headwind that sometimes the government's not running good agriculture programs. We have population growth, we have climate change. So it's not going to be easy to keep extreme poverty going down as quickly as it did the last 20 years. When
we talk about population, how do you address insufficiency amongst some in the developing world that say that promoting family planning may be an attempt to reduce certain population?
Well, in fact, as countries get healthy, that is you reduce the childhood death rate, families voluntarily choose to have less children. As you educate women more, families voluntarily choose to have less children. And so what we're about is just making sure people have, on a voluntary basis, access to these tools. And we do surveys on a very regular basis to understand, did you go to find it? Was it stocked out? Did you feel some pressure to use it, which would be inappropriate? And in the history of family planning, there have been cases where governments put too much pressure on people. But the good news is that even without inappropriate pressure, as we uplift families, they will choose to space their births more, which helps a lot with the health, and in some cases, have less children.
The gender gap in education is closing, but will persist in sub-Saharan Africa for the foreseeable future. So how can this be addressed to improve future outcome in education for young girls?
Within Africa, there are countries that do better on the gender gap than others, but I'd also highlight that the quality of the learning experience is still something we can do a lot. There are kids who are in school for long periods of time, and yet their ability to read sentences or do simple math is not very good. And so helping to train the teachers, making sure we're picking the teachers in the right way. We have still some work to do on access, particularly at secondary school. But then we also have work to do on quality. And education in some ways is harder than health, because in health, if we add a new vaccine, someday we'll have a malaria vaccine, someday we'll have a TB or an HIV vaccine. So, I can say that within my lifetime, these infectious diseases will be greatly reduced. In education, it's every day, training the teachers well, making sure they're doing their job well, making sure it's properly funded, making sure the cultural message that, yes, the girls should be here and that they have a positive, safe experience as part of their schooling. Every year we just have to get slightly better so we can have education empowering people, and that's really where Africa will thrive.
What is the role of communities? How can they be part of the solution in helping support the work that philanthropist organizations or even government tend to do to improve the quality of life of communities?
Well, education is something where the parents can get involved, whether it's after-school programs, talking to the kids that aren't engaging, who may be disruptive, sports programs, demanding to the government that the right things happen. Communities, I think, are our best bet. Parents, actually, they may not be experts on vaccines, but if their kid's not learning, they should be activated. And whether it's at the local level or their federal level, their expectations should be quite high compared to what's going on right now.
Okay, now let's talk about climate. The report talks about climate adaptation. To what extent is it possible to stop climate change, or is adaptation the way of the future?
Well, we certainly need to do both. I wish I could tell you that the mitigation effort, that is reducing the greenhouse gases, would be so successful that we wouldn't have to worry about adaptation. But even in the best case, we will have over 2 degrees of warming. And so whether it's droughts or big periods of heat, agriculture in Africa is going to be tougher in the future than it is today. One of the key things from the commission, which I was one of the co-chairs of, along with Ban Ki-moon and several other people, is that we need to make better seeds. The seed research system in the world is underfunded, and yet if we fund it properly, we'll come up with seeds that are more productive and can deal with the heat or the flood or need less water. And there's been some progress on that. But Africa, whose agricultural productivity is less than a quarter of, say, Europe or the United States, we can close that gap. And it's a bit about seeds, it's a bit about education, it's a bit about credit for fertilizer. All those things should allow us to get nutrition levels to improve even in the face of the challenges.
Bill Gates, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.